When thinking about what goes into the creation of a JRPG, there are a few key elements that appear in nearly every title in the genre. Story, characters, and engaging battle systems are essential, of course, but when it comes to delivering that immersive sense of adventure, nothing beats the feeling of diving headfirst into a foreboding and menacing dungeon. In Final Fantasy games, dungeons serve as not only important set pieces in the main scenario, but also optional undertakings along the way. Although varying in difficulty, many mandatory dungeons are tuned to a player's skill for the point in the game in which they appear, making them fun excursions to compete for loot or lore. But beyond that, there's the optional dungeons, which are anything but. Often accessible towards the end of the game, these devilish challenges up the ante, as while the main scenario of most Final Fantasy games is designed to be completed by the majority of people who play the games to the end, the optional dungeons were not. And the ones that we're discussing today would often require the player to go a little bit beyond the call of duty. To stand a chance against what lay in wait, it meant players would often need to max out levels, acquire the most powerful gear, and the best abilities and spells. But the reward was often worth it, even if that reward was just the satisfaction of knowing you'd never have to do it again. So today, we're going to explore 7 of the hardest optional dungeons in the history of Final Fantasy, with the caveat that we're only going to feature one dungeon per game. So, from a terrifying Tower of Tribulations through to the home of the High Seraph, let's get started with the trip under the sea to Final Fantasy VIII's Deep Sea Research Center. Final Fantasy VIII's world was home to many interesting optional locations for the player to explore, and more than a few held some intriguing challenges. Prominent examples would be the Central Ruins or the Tomb of the Unknown King, both of which offered players not only puzzles and tricky encounters, but also worthwhile rewards which often came in the form of powerful summons. But of all the optional dungeons worth exploring, few were as rewarding or challenging as the Deep Sea Research Center. Located in the far southwestern corner of the world map, the Deep Sea Research Center was accessible to the player after they had acquired the Ragnarok. In-game, it was described as a facility built to investigate the power of drawing powerful magic, and thus served as home to many dangerous and forbidden secrets waiting to be plundered by anyone brave enough to enter. Upon doing so, the first major challenge would be the Trial of Bahamut. This would see the player fight against numerous ruby dragons, something that would be followed by a conversation with Bahamut. But instead of fighting, Bahamut would challenge the player with words, questioning their motives via a riddle that could only be passed by selecting a hidden menu option beneath the ones displayed. Only once the correct answer was given would Bahamut force a fight, and once bested, the player would gain the ability to wield Bahamut as a guardian force. But that was not all the research center had to offer. After leaving and returning to Bahamut's chamber, players would notice a new pathway downwards into the depths of the facility. This descent was wrought with danger, as enemies encountered would be quite devilish. The player would also have to balance resources. Steam pressure units would be explained towards the start of the dungeon, and they would need to be spent to open and close pathways. But by the end of the dungeon, the player would only be able to begin the encounter with Ultima Weapon if they had 10 pressure units remaining. Winning this fight would prove quite challenging, but the player could net 100 Ultima Stones for their effort. Alternatively, Ultima Weapon could also be mugged during the fight for the very rare 3 stars item, and the player could even draw Eden, the most powerful guardian force in the game. Upon Ultima Weapon's defeat, all encounters in the dungeon would subsequently cease, allowing the player to relax, knowing that they had bested one of the toughest challenges that Final Fantasy VIII had to offer. By their nature, optional dungeons often take a bit more time to complete than standard dungeons. But even with the best made preparations, at the end of the day, players would still face the daunting task of trying to make their way through the dungeons. It's a sentiment that could apply to many we featured on this list, but there are none that embody it better than the infamous Via Infinito from Final Fantasy X-2. Consisting of a series of 100 floors, the Via Infinito was located beneath the city of Bevelle. Home to many dangerous fiends and powerful boss encounters, anyone looking to take on this arduous challenge needed to come well prepared with top-notch dress spheres and equipment. As the player descended down through randomly selected floor layouts, they would need to contend with enemy encounters, roaming fiends, and every 20 floors, a boss. Luckily, if the situation got dire, there were also healing glyphs scattered throughout that could fully restore a party on their journey or teleport them back to the entrance. The deeper the player went, the more they would encounter an increasingly diverse and difficult cast of fiends from all over Spira. This would eventually peak on floor 100, where the dungeon's two super bosses could be found, Paragon and Tremor, the founder of New Yevon. These would need to be defeated back to back, with no chance for recovery in between, making both fights very tough. There was a clear spike in difficulty between the two as well. Paragon had 200,000 HP and quick, powerful attacks, but Tremor had almost 1 million HP. But he also had the advantage of fighting the party right after they had already been weakened, and had extremely high evasion to boot, making him a difficult target to even hit with standard attacks. The reward for completing this lengthy quest was the Iron Duke, an accessory which raised all stats by 100, save for agility and luck, which were raised by 10 and 50 respectively. It also doubled the equipper's HP and MP. Not too shabby for a reward for completing one of the longest and most grueling dungeons ever to have featured in a Final Fantasy game. Now, taking a step back, the original Final Fantasy X wowed fans of the series when it offered a large and connected world to traverse through without there being a traditional world map. A few years later, Final Fantasy XII again offered fans an interconnected world, but this time it was bigger, had more interconnected paths, and most importantly, felt surprisingly open despite not technically being an open world game. As part of this, the game featured many locations and dungeons that would open up to allow for further exploration after certain story events had taken place, allowing players to delve deeper into some previously unexplored areas. This would usually lead to more treasure, and on more than one occasion, an Esper or super boss encounter. Which brings us to the Great Crystal. After heading to the Great Crystal as part of the main story, the party was able to return and explore its upper reaches. This was no simple task, however, as the player did not get a map of the Great Crystal in the traditional sense, but rather a vague indication of where they were, meaning they had to keep track themselves of their location using its internal naming convention system. The player would also find their progress halted at many points by doors called Zodiac Gates. These doors came in pairs, and only a single one could be opened at a time, requiring the player to activate the gate stone and then run to the gate they wished to open before a timer ran out, something made even more difficult due to the powerful enemies found roaming about throughout the Great Crystal. If players were able to work their way through the dungeon maze-like structure, what awaited them at the end was a battle with Ultima, the High Seraph, who the player would gain as an Esper if they emerged victorious. Obtaining Ultima was not the only challenge available in the Great Crystal though, as if the player had accepted the hunt for Yzmat, they could also take on the formidable Omega Mark 12. Omega was easily one of the toughest fights in the game, and its laser could even fell level 99 characters in just a few attacks. But managing to defeat it would grant the player the Omega Badge. This special item, when sold alongside Liu Shang's badge and the Godslayer's badge, allowed the player to purchase the bizarre item, the Worm Hero Blade. This was a very powerful greatsword, wieldable by anyone, as it did not require a license, and it also bared a striking resemblance to Erdrick's sword from Dragon Quest. The rewards for conquering the Great Crystal definitely made it a worthwhile side quest to undertake, and while it wasn't home to iconic enemies such as the infamous Yzmat, it did contain a particularly nasty collection of challenges that no other dungeon in Final Fantasy XII could match. Longtime fans of Final Fantasy know that Final Fantasy XII was not the first time Omega had featured as a superboss. In fact, by the time of Final Fantasy XII, alongside its original appearance in Final Fantasy V, it had also appeared in Dawn of Souls and Final Fantasy XI. Another completely unrelated but similarly named superboss known as Omega Weapon had also started to gain a recurring role in the series. First appearing in Final Fantasy VIII, it later featured more prominently in Final Fantasy X, where it was found in the depths of the appropriately named Omega Ruins, a large labyrinthian dungeon only accessible after acquiring the airship. Featuring an expansive and obscured map, along with some of the toughest random encounters in the entire game, players who could best the puzzles of this dark dungeon would find themselves with some worthwhile loot, if they were lucky. This was because the treasure chests in the Omega Ruins appeared in groups, and if the player opened the incorrect one first, then they would be treated to a mimic encounter and the remaining chests would disappear. Unfortunately, this would lock them out of the chance to acquire not only the remaining chests as content, but also the 99 warp spheres that could be obtained after successfully opening all 12 chests in the dungeon. Ignoring that, at the end of the first segment of the dungeon, the player could test their strength against Ultimate Weapon, who guarded a lift deeper into the ruins where Omega Weapon could be found. Ultimate Weapon only served as a taste of what was to come, however, as those who managed to brave the journey to Omega Weapon's chamber would find themselves face to face with a formidable foe who could easily wipe out an unprepared party due to its powerful Nova ability. Interestingly, the same thing that made Omega Weapon difficult was also what made facing him worthwhile. Nova just happened to be one of the most powerful attacks in the entire game and could be learnt by Kimahri for use through his Ronzo Rage ability. While not as challenging an undertaking as the Dark Aeons or Penance, the Omega Ruins still posed a high level of difficulty to players who chose to take it on, and those who did would find themselves rewarded with some of the best treasure, the best enemy drops, and the best Ronzo Rage abilities in the game. Difficult combat encounters are to be expected when traversing an optional dungeon in a Final Fantasy game, but rarely is combat the sole focus. When it is though, one can be sure that they'll be in for quite a fight. The Faultwarrens in Final Fantasy XIII embodied exactly that kind of challenge, as they forced the player to conquer a series of enemy encounters in a gauntlet, one after another. Located on Grand Pulse and overseen by the Fal'Cie Titan, the Faultwarrens consisted of 5 battles against powerful foes that pushed the player's combat abilities and demanded a good deal of preparation to complete. After each fight, 2 Seath Stones from new missions would appear to offer the player a choice in the next challenge, allowing them to essentially pick their proverbial poison. If the player managed to complete every battle and Seath Stone mission in the dungeon, a task that would necessitate multiple run-throughs, they could then seek out an additional challenge in the area, Mission 51. This mission would task them with slaying an Undying known as Atticus, and could be considered the true challenge of the Faultwarrens. Atticus was not the only difficult encounter found in the Faultwarrens, it should be said, with the encounters against the Tombares and Niochu also being particularly tricky, but it was also the most likely to decimate players who were not knowledgeable of the fight. This was because Atticus hit hard, hit fast, and all of his attacks could debuff the party. Not to mention, the fight also consisted of 3 stages, each of which was marked by Atticus buffing itself and becoming even more powerful. For completing Mission 51 and defeating Atticus, the player would receive the Genji Glove, a powerful accessory that uncapped the damage limit and allowed players to deal almost 1 million points of damage with a single strike. It made completing the Faultwarrens an extremely worthwhile task for those up to the challenge, even if they would have to complete it multiple times to obtain the true rewards. Similar to the Faultwarrens, another entry into the Fabula Nova Crystallis subseries decided to test players by making its most difficult optional dungeon a battle gauntlet. Final Fantasy Type 0 featured numerous difficult missions for the player to undertake, but when it came to optional dungeons, few held a candle to the Tower of Agito, an area that was not accessible until after the player had obtained the airship Setzer. While its layout was simple, consisting of just 5 chambers filled with enemies and then a boss encounter at the top, the task of completing it was anything but. This was due to the fact that the player had to fight 100 of the same powerful enemy in each chamber, all set to level 128, meaning that even max level characters were at a significant risk of being defeated. In the first chamber of the tower, the player would need to fight 100 Tombares, which appeared in groups of 4 until the player had slain 50. They would then appear in groups of 5. The second chamber would have 50 pairs of curls. The third and fourth would then have the player fight 100 Glacier Labidas and Mashushus respectively, spawning individually until 30 were defeated, then switching to pairs until 70 had been defeated, and finally peaking at groups of 3 until all 100 were taken down. It was the last 2 challenges that would prove to be some of the biggest hurdles though, as the 5th chamber would see the party encounter 100 Behemoth Kings, who would appear in pairs after 50 had been defeated. The final task would then be defeating the boss, the Cosmic Malboro. This final battle, while extremely dangerous, was thankfully a little bit easier than the previous challenges. Still, its might was not to be underestimated, and a careless approach would immediately spell doom. Beating the Cosmic Malboro would reward the player with an incredibly useful accessory known as the Agito Insignia, which could only be obtained once per playthrough. This item gave the player a 50% damage reduction, immunity to all status ailments and weather effects, auto protect, regen, aura, trance, free cast, and quick, as well as granting 4 times the experience. For our final entry today, we'd like to take a different approach as to what constitutes a difficult optional dungeon, and that places the spotlight on a dungeon without any combat at all, the Pitioss Ruins from Final Fantasy XV. As mentioned, difficult combat and super bosses were often the defining features of many optional dungeons. While puzzles frequently played a role, forcing players to conserve resources or search for switches, they usually took a back seat in comparison to the various monsters that would need to be encountered and defeated. What Final Fantasy XV did with the Pitioss Ruins was to turn this concept on its head, focusing entirely on the puzzle aspect, along with a solid amount of platforming segments. Only accessible by using the Regalia Type F, the Pitioss Ruins were an ancient Solheim training ground where the laws of physics were distorted. Featuring striking visual designs and references to the remnants of an ancient civilization, this area was only accessible at night and by Noctis alone. The main challenge of the Pitioss Ruins was its difficult platforming and puzzle sections, testing the player's physical control over Noctis' abilities and spatial awareness. And just because there were no enemies in the area, it did not mean the Pitioss Ruins were devoid of danger, as the ruins featured many fail states that could injure Noctis or set his progress back as punishment for not executing a jump correctly or taking the wrong step. Luckily, the dungeon also featured some handy checkpoints and opportunities to create shortcuts, making spelunking further inside a little bit less daunting. This was useful to the player as the Pitioss Ruins also featured some very valuable loot, and its grand prize was the Black Hood. Rewarding the player for their mastery of movement, this item would grant Noctis the ability to auto-parry and phase through enemy attacks, which, while not making him invincible, considerably lowered the difficulty of combat. This made the Black Hood an extremely valuable item, and one definitely worth the challenge of besting all the Pitioss Ruins had to offer. And with that, I think we're done. They were 7 of the hardest optional dungeons that we found in Final Fantasy, but I'm sure there are plenty more out there. Let us know in the comments which dungeon you found to be the most challenging, and if you enjoyed this video, please give us a like and hit the subscribe button. Alright everyone, with that, this is Daryl signing out. I'd like to extend a big thank you to all of our Patreon and YouTube membership supporters, especially Benjamin Snow, the livestream, Galcian Di Kujata, Gregory and Lord of Morning, who are super special Onion Knight supporters, and of course, a big thank you to everyone for watching this video. I'll see you all again soon for more Final Fantasy goodness.